The air in the Curia of Pompey is thick with the scent of wool, sweat, and something else, conspiracy. It is the 15th of March, 44 BCE. The Ides, 60 men, their hands hidden in the folds of their togas, watch as one man enters the chamber. He is 55 years old, but he holds the world in his hands. He is a general who never lost a war, a politician who never lost a vote he truly cared about, an author, a high priest, a lover, a revolutionary. He is Gaius Julius Caesar, dictator in perpetuity of the Roman Republic. He takes his seat on a gilded chair. A senator, Tullius Cimber, approaches, feigning a petition. Others crowd around, a show of support for the plea. It is a performance, a deadly one. Cimber grabs Caesar's toga and pulls it from his shoulders. It is the signal. From behind, a dagger strikes, just below the neck. The first blow is not fatal, but it is the first of many. Caesar turns, his military instincts still sharp, and impales the attacker's arm with his writing stylus. But then another blade finds its mark. And another. He sees he is surrounded, a forest of steel flashing in the Roman light. He fights back, a cornered lion, until he sees a face in the crowd of killers. A face he knows, a face he trusts. Marcus Junius Brutus. Caesar stops struggling. He pulls his toga over his head, unwilling to let his assassins see his face in the final moment, and collapses at the foot of a statue of his great rival Pompey. He is stabbed 23 times. How did it come to this? How did the most powerful man in the world end up butchered on the floor of the Senate by his own colleagues, his own friends? To understand the death of Caesar, you must first understand the life. You must understand the man and the violent, decaying world that forged him. His story is not just the biography of a single man. It is the autopsy of a republic. And it begins not in the halls of power, but in a city tearing itself apart at the seams. The forge of ambition. The story of Gaius Julius Caesar begins on the 12th or 13th of July, in the year 100 BCE. He was born into the gens Julia, one of Rome's ancient patrician families, the aristocracy of the Republic. The Julii were respectable, with a lineage stretching back into the mists of Rome's founding. But they were not among the wealthiest or most dominant clans of their day. Their greatest asset was not money or legions, but a story, a potent piece of political branding they had cultivated for generations. They claimed direct descent from the goddess Venus, through the Trojan hero Aeneas and his son, Julius. This was more than a quaint family tree. It was a declaration of divine right, a political tool Caesar would learn to wield with surgical precision. The Rome of Caesar's boyhood was no glorious, stable republic. It was a city convulsed by violence, a tinderbox of factional hatred and personal ambition. The old republican system, designed for a small city-state, was cracking under the strain of a burgeoning empire. Power was polarizing around two factions. The Optimates, the best men, who sought to preserve the traditional power of the aristocratic Senate, and the Populares, the men of the people, who used popular assemblies and populist rhetoric to challenge the senatorial elite. This was not a debate society. It was a death match. The dominant figures of Caesar's youth were two titans who embodied this struggle: Lucius Cornelius Sulla, the champion of the Optimates, and Caesar's own uncle by marriage, Gaius Marius, the hero of the Populares. Caesar grew up watching these men and their followers butcher each other in the streets and in the courts. He learned a fundamental lesson that would define his life. In this new Rome, the old rules were dying. The Constitution was a weapon to be used, not a principle to be revered. Real power flowed not from tradition, but from the loyalty of an army and the roar of the crowd. His family's allegiance was clear. They were Marians tied to the Populares faction. This connection was solidified when Caesar's father died when he was just a teenager, making him the paterfamilias, the head of his family, at a dangerously young age. In 84 BCE, he cemented his political identity by marrying Cornelia, the daughter of Lucius Cornelius Cinna, Marius's most powerful ally. Through his uncle's influence, he was also nominated for the prestigious and ancient priesthood of Jupiter, the Flamen Dialis. At 17, Caesar was a young man on a clear path, tied inextricably to one side of Rome's bloody political divide. But in the Roman Republic, when one side was up, the other was marked for death. In 82 BCE, the pendulum of power swung with brutal force. Sulla, having returned victorious from the east, marched his legions on Rome, seized the city, and declared himself dictator. He immediately initiated the proscriptions, a legalized reign of terror. Lists of his political enemies were posted in the Forum, declaring them outlaws who could be hunted down and killed for a reward, their property confiscated by the state. As a nephew of Marius and the son-in-law of Cinna, Caesar was a prime target. Sulla issued a simple command: divorce Cornelia. For Sulla, this was a political test of loyalty. For the 18-year-old Caesar, it was a defining choice. To obey would be to repudiate his heritage, his alliances, and his own honor. To refuse would be to sign his own death warrant. Caesar refused. It was his first great act of defiance, a flash of the unwavering resolve that would later terrify his enemies. He was immediately stripped of his priesthood, his wife's dowry, and his family inheritance. He was forced to go into hiding, moving from house to house in the Sabine Hills, a fugitive in his own country. According to the biographer Plutarch, Sulla was urged by some to spare the boy, but the old dictator saw something dangerous in him, remarking that his advisors had no sense if they did not see many Marie in this boy. Eventually, powerful friends and relatives, including the Vestal Virgins, interceded on Caesar's behalf, and Sulla grudgingly spared him. But Rome was no longer safe. Caesar left Italy and did what many young, ambitious aristocrats did. He joined the army. He served on the personal staff of the praetor in the province of Asia. It was here, during the siege of the city of Mytilene in 80 BCE, that Caesar first tasted military glory. In the heat of battle, he distinguished himself with conspicuous bravery, saving the life of a fellow citizen. For this act, he was awarded the Corona Civica, the civic crown. This was no mere medal. It was a chaplet of oak leaves, the second highest military decoration a Roman could receive. It carried immense prestige and tangible political benefits, including the right to a seat in the Senate. When a recipient of the civic crown entered a public venue like the theater, even the senators were expected to stand in his honor. The young exile, dispossessed and marked for death only 2 years prior, now had a symbol of heroism and public virtue that he could wear for the rest of his life. He was learning how to turn adversity into advantage, a skill that would become his hallmark. After Sulla's death in 78 BCE, Caesar returned to Rome. He began his political career in the conventional way, as a prosecuting advocate in the law courts. But his targets were anything but conventional. He chose to prosecute prominent supporters of the former dictator Sulla for corruption and extortion, most notably Gnaeus Cornelius Dolabella. It was a bold move, a direct challenge to the establishment. Dolabella was defended by the leading orators of the day and acquitted by a jury of senators sympathetic to their own kind. But Caesar's fiery and brilliant rhetoric made a name for him. He was marked as a man of talent and, more importantly, a man of courage. Seeking to further hone his skills, Caesar set sail in 75 BCE for the island of Rhodes, to study oratory with the most famous teacher of the age, Apollonius Molon. It was on this journey that one of the most revealing episodes of his early life occurred. Near the island of Pharmacusa, his ship was captured by Cilician pirates. Piracy was a rampant plague in the Mediterranean, a symptom of the Republic's decaying control over its own seas. The pirates demanded a ransom of 20 talents of silver, a huge sum. According to Plutarch and Suetonius, Caesar simply laughed in their faces. He told them they clearly didn't know who they had captured and insisted that he was worth at least 50 talents. The story, almost certainly embellished by Caesar for maximum political effect, paints a picture of astonishing audacity. For 38 days, he lived among his captors not as a prisoner, but as their commander. He composed speeches and poems, reciting them to the pirates and calling them illiterate barbarians when they failed to show sufficient appreciation. He joined in their games and exercises, but always demanded they keep quiet when he wished to sleep. All the while, he jokingly, laughingly, threatened that one day he would return and have them all crucified. The pirates, charmed by their precocious and eccentric captive, took it as a jest. It was not. Once the 50 talents arrived and he was released, Caesar immediately went to the port of Miletus. Acting as a private citizen with no official authority, he raised a naval force, manned it with volunteers, and hunted his former captors down. He found them still camped on the same island, captured them and their treasure, and took them to a prison in Pergamon. When the local governor, who fancied the ransom money for himself, vacillated on punishing them, Caesar took matters into his own hands. He went to the prison and had every single one of them crucified, just as he had promised, to show a sliver of mercy. He had their throats cut first to lessen their suffering. This single episode revealed the core of the man Caesar was becoming: audacious, utterly self-assured, ruthless, and possessing an innate belief in his own authority, an authority that transcended the laws and offices of the state. Back in Rome, Caesar began his formal ascent up the cursus honorum, the course of honors or ladder of political offices that defined an aristocratic Roman's career. In 69 BCE, he was elected quaestor, the first official rung, and was assigned to a province in farther Spain. This post automatically granted him a lifetime seat in the Senate. That same year, his wife Cornelia died, as did his aunt Julia, the widow of the great Marius. Caesar seized the opportunity for masterful political theater. He delivered magnificent public funeral orations for both women. For his aunt, he made a point of parading the images of Marius, which had been banned since Sulla's dictatorship. The older generation wept to see the symbols of their hero restored, and the younger generation was captivated by this bold young man publicly aligning himself with the revered popular's tradition. He was not just mourning, he was building his brand. In 65 BCE, Caesar was elected aedile, an office responsible for the maintenance of public buildings and, most importantly, the staging of public games. This was the ultimate platform for a populist politician to win the hearts of the Roman masses. Caesar understood this perfectly. He borrowed colossal sums of money, plunging himself into a level of debt that terrified his contemporaries, and staged the most lavish, spectacular games Rome had ever seen. He decorated the Forum and the Capitoline Hill, held enormous public banquets, and presented wild beast hunts and theatrical productions. For the gladiatorial contests, he brought 320 pairs of gladiators to Rome, all outfitted in silvered armor. The Senate grew so alarmed at the size of his private gladiator army that they passed a law limiting the number any one individual could keep in the city. But the people were ecstatic. They adored him. He was buying their loyalty with borrowed money, a gamble that he was calculating would pay off with the highest offices in the state. His next move was even more audacious. In 63 BCE, the lifetime post of Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of the Roman state religion, became vacant. It was a position of immense prestige and influence, traditionally held by a senior, distinguished ex-consul. Two of the most powerful men in Rome, both optimates, were the leading candidates. Caesar, still in his 30s and only having reached the rank of aedile, threw his hat in the ring. He spent so heavily on bribes that on the morning of the election, he reportedly told his mother, Aurelia, "Today you will see me either high priest or in exile." He won a landslide victory. The establishment was stunned and horrified. This charismatic, popular, and dangerously ambitious man now held the highest religious office in Rome for life, complete with an official residence in the heart of the Forum. The following year, 62 BCE, while Caesar was serving as praetor or chief magistrate, that very house became the scene of a notorious scandal. His second wife, Pompeia, was hosting the rites of the Bona Dei, a mysterious, all-female religious festival from which men were so strictly forbidden that even male portraits in the house had to be veiled. Into this sacred space, a decadent young patrician named Publius Clodius Pulcher snuck in, disguised as a female flute player, allegedly in an attempt to seduce Pompeia. He was discovered, and the ensuing scandal rocked Rome. Clodius was put on trial for sacrilege. Caesar, whose household had been violated, gave no evidence against him, and Clodius was acquitted, likely through bribery. Yet, despite the acquittal and no proof of any wrongdoing on his wife's part, Caesar divorced Pompeia. When asked why, he gave the immortal reply that has echoed through the centuries: Caesar's wife must be above suspicion. It was a masterstroke of public relations. He turned a moment of deep personal and political embarrassment into a demonstration of his own unimpeachable commitment to public piety and honor, distancing himself from the scandal while appearing to be a man of the highest moral standards. After his praetorship, Caesar's massive debts nearly caught up with him. His creditors prevented him from leaving for his next post as governor of Spain until the wealthiest man in Rome, Marcus Licinius Crassus, stood bail for a portion of the debt. In Spain, in 61 BCE, Caesar finally had command of legions again. He waged a series of successful and profitable campaigns, enriching himself, his soldiers, and the state. He returned to Rome in 60 BCE a conquering general, entitled to a triumph, the glorious victory parade through the city. But he also wanted to stand for the highest office of all, the consulship. Roman law, however, presented a dilemma. To be eligible for a triumph, a general had to remain outside the city's formal boundary, with his army. To stand for election as consul, a candidate had to be present in the city as a private citizen. His enemies in the Senate, led by the rigidly conservative Cato the Younger, refused to grant him an exemption. They forced him to choose the glory of the parade or the substance of power. Caesar did not hesitate. He gave up his triumph, marched into Rome as a private citizen, and declared his candidacy for consul. He had his eyes on a far greater prize than a single day's glory. He was ready to take control of the republic itself. The three-headed monster. By 60 BCE, the Roman Republic was in a state of political paralysis. The machinery of government, designed for a city-state, was being choked by the ambitions of titans it could no longer control. The Senate, led by a faction of hardline conservatives known as the Optimates, had become masters of obstruction. Their strategy was simple: block anything that threatened their traditional authority, regardless of the consequences for the state. This intransigence created a power vacuum, and three men stood ready to fill it. The first was Gnaeus Pompeius, known as Pompey the Great. He was Rome's most celebrated general, the conqueror of pirates and Eastern kings. He had returned to Rome 2 years earlier expecting honors and rewards for his men. Instead, the Senate, led by his personal enemies like Lucullus and the unyielding Cato the Younger, refused to ratify the political settlements he had made in the East and, most critically, denied his requests for land to be given to his tens of thousands of loyal, demobilized veterans. Pompey, the hero of the Republic, found himself politically impotent, his promises to his men unfulfilled. The second was Marcus Licinius Crassus, a man of immense ambition whose defining feature was his almost limitless wealth. He had put down the slave revolt of Spartacus but craved the kind of military glory that Pompey possessed. In the short term, he sought financial relief for the equestrian tax farming companies he backed, who had overbid on contracts in Asia. The Senate, again led by Cato, flatly refused, humiliating Crassus and his powerful business allies. And then there was Caesar. Returning from his successful governorship in Spain, he was the junior figure of the three but by far the most politically astute. He saw what the others did not, that their individual frustrations could be solved by collective power. He recognized that the Republic's gridlock was not a problem to be solved within the system, but an obstacle to be bypassed entirely. The system itself had failed, unable to contain the ambitions of its most powerful citizens. The formation of the triumvirate was not the cause of the Republic's fall, but its most glaring symptom. It was an admission that private power had eclipsed public authority. Caesar approached Pompey, his former rival, and Crassus, his creditor and a man who deeply disliked Pompey, and brokered an unthinkable deal. They would form a secret, informal political alliance, an amicitia or friendship, that their enemies would later call the monstrum triceps, the three-headed monster. They would pool their resources: Pompey's military prestige and veterans, Crassus's vast fortune, and Caesar's popular support and political genius. Together, they would seize control of the state and force through their agendas. To seal this momentous and dangerous pact, Caesar gave his only child, his beloved daughter Julia, in marriage to the much older Pompey, binding the two men together with a fragile family tie. The triumvirate's first order of business was to secure the consulship for Caesar in 59 BCE. With the backing of his new allies, he was easily elected. However, the Optimates, deploying vast sums in bribes, managed to install one of their own, Marcus Calpurnius Bibulus, as his co-consul, with the explicit mission of obstructing Caesar at every turn. What followed was one of the most tumultuous and constitutionally fraught years in Roman history. Caesar began by proposing a moderate and reasonable agrarian law to purchase land for settling Pompey's veterans and the urban poor. He presented it to the Senate first, a gesture of respect. Cato responded by filibustering, attempting to talk the bill to death. When Caesar tried to have Cato arrested, the Senate rose in protest. Frustrated, Caesar took the unprecedented step of taking the law directly to the People's Assembly, bypassing the Senate entirely. Bibulus, his co-consul, tried to block him. He declared the omens for the day to be unfavorable, a religious veto that should have halted all public business. Caesar ignored him. When Bibulus appeared in the forum to protest, he was assaulted by Caesar's supporters. A bucket of dung was dumped on his head, and his fasces, the bundled rods symbolizing his consular authority, were smashed before his eyes. Utterly humiliated and fearing for his life, Bibulus retreated to his house for the rest of his term, from where he would periodically issue edicts declaring that the omens were perpetually bad and that all of Caesar's actions were therefore invalid. He was ignored. For the rest of the year, Rome had, in effect, a single consul. The wags in the city took to dating their documents not in the consulship of Caesar and Bibulus, but in the consulship of Julius and Caesar. With Bibulus sidelined, Caesar moved with lightning speed. He pushed his agrarian law through the assembly. He then swiftly passed legislation ratifying all of Pompey's eastern settlements and granting Crassus the tax rebates he desired. He had delivered for his allies. Then he delivered for himself. Through a law proposed by his loyal tribune, Publius Vatinius, Caesar secured for himself a 5-year proconsular command of Cisalpine Gaul, northern Italy, and Illyricum, the Balkan coast. The cowed Senate, perhaps hoping to keep him occupied far from Rome, added Transalpine Gaul, southern France, to his command. This was the ultimate prize. It gave him an army, a vast territory from which to launch campaigns and amass wealth, and, most importantly, imperium, the legal authority of a commander that made him immune from prosecution by his enemies in Rome. The consulship of 59 BCE was over. Caesar had bent the republic to his will, and now he was marching north, towards a destiny that would make him a legend. Caesar's command in Gaul was not initially a mandate for unlimited conquest. It was a proconsular governorship, intended for the administration and defense of existing Roman territory. But Caesar's ambition, coupled with the volatile situation on the ground, created a cascade of opportunities that he ruthlessly exploited. The conquest of Gaul was not a grand, premeditated plan. It was a brilliant, brutal, and escalating improvisation. In 58 BCE, his pretext arrived. The Helvetii, a large confederation of Celtic tribes from modern-day Switzerland, began a mass migration westward, seeking new lands. Their path threatened the territory of Roman allies and the province of Transalpine Gaul itself. Caesar responded decisively. He raised new legions, marched to meet them, and crushed them at the Battle of Bibracte, forcing the survivors back to their homeland. This first victory created a new reality. Caesar was now a major power broker in central Gaul. Other Gallic tribes, threatened by the incursions of a powerful Germanic chieftain named Ariovistus, appealed to Caesar for aid. Seizing the chance to portray himself as a protector of Gallic liberties, Caesar confronted and annihilated Ariovistus's army at the Battle of Vosges. In just 1 year, he had defeated 2 of the most formidable barbarian forces in Europe. Each victory, however, only expanded his frontier and brought him into contact with new, wary tribes. In 57 BCE, he turned his attention north to the powerful and warlike Belgae. In a series of swift campaigns, he subdued them, culminating in one of the most desperate battles of his career. At the Battle of the Sabas River, his legions were caught by surprise and nearly overwhelmed by the ferocious Nervii tribe. The Roman line was on the verge of collapse until Caesar himself, grabbing a shield from a soldier in the rear, plunged into the front ranks to rally his men. His personal courage and the timely arrival of reinforcements turned a potential catastrophe into a stunning victory. The following years saw him crush a rebellion by the maritime Veneti in a naval battle off the Atlantic coast, and conduct 2 daring expeditions across the English Channel to Britain in 55 and 54 BCE. These British campaigns were more propaganda than conquest. No Roman had ever led an army there before, but they electrified the public back in Rome and burnished his legend. Throughout these years of relentless campaigning, Caesar was waging another war, a war for public opinion. He was meticulously composing his Commentarii de Bello Gallico, the commentaries on the Gallic War. Written in a famously lean, direct, and seemingly objective third-person prose, the commentaries were far more than a simple campaign diary. They were a masterpiece of political propaganda, dispatched to Rome to be read aloud in the Forum. In their pages, Caesar carefully constructed his own myth. He was the brilliant, decisive general, acting always in defense of Rome and its allies. The Gauls were portrayed as brave but fickle, treacherous, and barbaric, justifying his often brutal actions as necessary for the security of the Republic. The commentaries ensured that while Caesar was physically absent from Rome, his name, his victories, and his version of events were ever present in the minds of the people and the Senate. The brutal effectiveness of Caesar's campaigns eventually provoked the one thing the Romans had always feared: a united Gaul. In 52 BCE, a charismatic chieftain of the Arverni tribe, Vercingetorix, forged a grand coalition of Gallic peoples in a massive, coordinated rebellion. Vercingetorix was a formidable opponent who had learned from Roman tactics. He initiated a scorched earth policy, burning Gallic towns and farms to deny Caesar's legion supplies, and he handed Caesar a rare and stinging defeat at the siege of Gergovia. The Gallic War had reached its crisis point. The final, decisive confrontation came at the hilltop fortress, or oppidum, of Alesia. Here, Vercingetorix and his main army of some 80,000 warriors made their stand. Caesar, arriving with his legions, knew a direct assault would be suicidal. Instead, he laid siege to the fortress, embarking on one of the most astonishing feats of military engineering in history. His men constructed a massive 11-mile line of fortifications, walls, ditches, towers, and deadly traps, completely encircling the oppidum. This was the line of circumvallation, designed to starve the Gauls into submission. But Caesar knew Vercingetorix had sent for reinforcements. So, he ordered his men to build a second, even larger line of fortifications, the contravallation, facing outwards to protect his own army from the inevitable Gallic relief force. Caesar had turned his siege into a fortress, deliberately trapping his own army between 2 massive enemy forces. The climax was desperate and bloody, as the massive Gallic relief army, estimated by Caesar at 250,000 men, arrived and threw itself against the Roman outer wall. Vercingetorix sallied forth from Alesia to attack the inner wall. Caesar's legions were caught in a deadly vice, fighting for their lives on 2 fronts simultaneously. Riding along the lines, Caesar personally directed the defense, shifting cohorts to plug gaps, leading counterattacks, his red cloak a beacon of defiance in the chaos. In the end, the discipline of the legions and Caesar's tactical genius held. The Gallic relief army was broken and fled. Seeing this, the starving defenders in Alesia lost all hope. The next day, Vercingetorix, in a final act of dignity, rode out of the fortress and surrendered himself to Caesar. The great revolt was over. The conquest of Gaul was complete. It had come at a staggering cost. Caesar's own accounts, though likely exaggerated, suggest that of a population of millions, 1 million Gauls had been killed and another million sold into slavery. While Caesar was conquering Gaul, the political alliance that had enabled his rise was disintegrating. The triumvirate had been renewed at a conference in Lucca in 56 BCE, which granted Caesar another 5 years in Gaul and gave Pompey and Crassus their own long-term provincial commands. But the bonds holding the three men together were personal and pragmatic, and they soon snapped. In 54 BCE, Julia, Caesar's daughter and Pompey's wife, died in childbirth. The personal link between the two great rivals was gone. Then, in 53 BCE, Crassus, seeking the military glory that had always eluded him, led an army into Parthia. At the Battle of Carrhae, his army was annihilated, and Crassus himself was captured and killed. The three-headed monster was now down to two. Back in Rome, Pompey, now the sole great man in the city, grew increasingly jealous and fearful of Caesar's staggering success, wealth, and the fanatical loyalty of his veteran legions. He allowed himself to be drawn into an alliance with his old enemies, the conservative Optimates. The Senate, with Pompey's backing, began to lay the legal groundwork to strip Caesar of his command and prosecute him the moment his immunity expired. Caesar had conquered Gaul. Now he would have to conquer Rome. The die is cast. The year 50 BCE was a year of shadows and whispers in Rome. The air was electric with tension as the two most powerful men in the world, once allies, now circled each other like wary gladiators. In Gaul, Gaius Julius Caesar commanded a hardened, veteran army of unparalleled loyalty and experience, an army that had conquered a nation. In Rome, Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, Pompey the Great, had the backing of the Senate and the constitutional legitimacy of the Republic. The political maneuvering reached a fever pitch. The Senate, now Pompey's instrument, issued its demand. Caesar must disband his legions, relinquish his provincial command, and return to Rome as a private citizen. To do so would be to walk willingly into the hands of his enemies, who had made no secret of their intention to prosecute, convict, and politically destroy him. Caesar, from his base in Ravenna, sent a series of compromises. He was willing to lay down his command, but only if Pompey did the same simultaneously. Let both men, he argued, return to the status of private citizens. The proposal was reasonable, even popular. A motion in the Senate that both men should disarm passed by a massive majority of 370 to 22. But the hardline conservatives, backed by Pompey's silent consent, refused. They would not be seen to negotiate with a proconsul at the head of an army. They pushed the Senate to issue the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, the final decree of the Senate, a declaration of martial law that effectively branded Caesar an enemy of the state. The tribunes who supported Caesar and vetoed the motion were threatened and forced to flee the city for their lives, giving Caesar a powerful new pretext. He was now the defender of the sacred rights of the people's representatives. The time for talk was over. On the night of January 10th, 49 BCE, Caesar led a single legion, the 13th, to the banks of a small river called the Rubicon. This insignificant stream marked the sacred boundary, the Pomerium, between his province of Cisalpine Gaul and Italy proper. To cross it with an army was forbidden by ancient law. It was an act of insurrection, of treason, a declaration of war against his own country. The ancient historians paint a dramatic picture of Caesar hesitating on the riverbank, weighing the monumental consequences of his next step. He knew this was the point of no return. Then, turning to his men, he uttered the immortal phrase, Alia iacta est, the die is cast. He spurred his horse into the water, and the Roman world plunged into civil war. Caesar's defining military characteristic was speed, and his advance into Italy was a thunderbolt. He moved so quickly that his opponents were caught completely flat-footed. Towns and cities opened their gates to him, their garrisons melting away. In Rome, panic erupted. Pompey and the Senate had fatally miscalculated. They had assumed Caesar would hesitate, or that the towns of Italy would rally to the Republic. They did neither. Unprepared to fight a war on Italian soil, Pompey made a momentous decision. He abandoned Rome, ordering the consuls and hundreds of senators to flee with him. They retreated south to the port of Brundisium, and from there, sailed across the Adriatic to Greece. There, in the east, lay the vast manpower and wealth of the provinces loyal to him. He would raise a great army and return to crush the rebel. Caesar had won Italy without a major battle, but he now faced a strategic nightmare. Pompey controlled the seas with a massive fleet, and his most powerful and experienced legions were not in Greece, but in Spain. Caesar was trapped between two hostile forces. It was at this moment that he made a move of counterintuitive genius. Instead of pursuing Pompey to Greece, he decided to deal with the threat at his back first. He famously declared, "I am off to meet an army without a leader. When I return, I shall meet a leader without an army." He marched his legions overland at incredible speed to Spain. In a brilliant campaign of maneuver and engineering near the town of Alerta, he surrounded and trapped the Pompeian armies, cutting off their supplies and forcing their surrender without a bloody battle. Having secured his western flank, he returned to Italy, was briefly made dictator to oversee his own election as consul, and then prepared for the main event, the confrontation with Pompey himself. In January of 48 BCE, Caesar executed another audacious gamble. He gathered what ships he could and, despite the risk of Pompey's blockading fleet and the treacherous winter seas, he ferried half his army, 7 legions, across the Adriatic to Epirus in modern Albania. He was now in Pompey's heartland, outnumbered, with his supply lines cut, and the other half of his army stranded back in Italy. For months, the two great generals maneuvered around each other. At the Battle of Dyrrhachium, Caesar attempted to besiege Pompey's much larger army and suffered a sharp defeat, his first major setback in the war. He was forced to retreat inland, his army starving, his campaign on the brink of collapse. Pompey's officers urged him to finish Caesar off, but Pompey, ever cautious, hesitated. It was a fatal error. Caesar was allowed to escape, regroup, and lead his army into the plains of Thessaly, drawing Pompey after him for a final, decisive battle. The two armies met on the 9th of August 48 BCE on a plain near the town of Pharsalus. The fate of the world hung in the balance. This was not just a battle. It was a duel between two of the greatest Romans who had ever lived, a personal contest for supremacy. Pompey's army was a vast, multinational force, numbering perhaps 45,000 infantry and 7,000 cavalry, drawn from across the eastern Mediterranean. Caesar's army was smaller, around 22,000 infantry and a mere 1,000 cavalry. But they were the hardened, devoted veterans of the Gallic Wars, men who would follow Caesar anywhere. Pompey, urged on by the arrogant senators in his camp who were tired of his cautious strategy, was supremely confident. His plan was simple and seemingly foolproof. His massive cavalry superiority on his left flank would smash Caesar's weaker cavalry, then wheel around and envelop the legions from the rear. Caesar, a master of reading his opponent's intentions, anticipated this move exactly. In a stroke of tactical genius that would win him the battle, he secretly detached several cohorts, around 3,000 of his best infantry, from his third line and created a hidden fourth line, positioned at an angle behind his own cavalry on the right flank. He gave these men specific, unusual orders. Do not throw your javelins, pila. Instead, hold them and use them as stabbing spears, aiming for the faces and eyes of the charging enemy horsemen. The battle began. The legions in the center crashed together. Then Pompey gave the signal. His 7,000 cavalry thundered across the plain, easily overwhelming Caesar's small contingent of horsemen, who fell back as planned. As the Pompeian cavalry surged forward in what they thought was a triumphant pursuit, they suddenly slammed into the bristling spear points of Caesar's hidden fourth line. The shock was total. The charge broke in confusion and panic. The elite horsemen, unaccustomed to such direct infantry assault, routed and fled the field, leaving Pompey's infantry flank completely exposed. Caesar immediately unleashed his reserve. The fourth line wheeled and crashed into the rear of Pompey's legions, while Caesar's third line, which he had held back, now charged into the fray. Attacked from the front, flank, and rear, the Pompeian army disintegrated. Pompey the Great, seeing his legions collapse, seemed to lose his nerve. He rode back to his camp, stunned, and then fled in disguise. The battle was a catastrophic defeat for the Republican cause. Caesar, in his moment of total victory, showed his characteristic clemency. pardoning the captured senators and officers, including a man named Marcus Junius Brutus. Pompey's flight took him across the Mediterranean to Egypt, where he hoped to find refuge with the court of the young King Ptolemy XIII, whose father he had once aided. But the Egyptian court was a nest of vipers. The king's advisors, seeing that Pompey was a defeated man, decided that the favor of the victor was worth more than loyalty to a fallen friend. As Pompey stepped ashore from his boat, he was stabbed in the back and beheaded. When Caesar arrived in Alexandria a few days later in hot pursuit, he was presented with his rival's severed head in a basket. The ancient sources say that he turned away in disgust and wept, whether from genuine grief for his former son-in-law or from outrage at the murder of a Roman consul by foreigners, we will never know. Caesar's arrival plunged him into another conflict, the dynastic civil war of Egypt. The throne was contested by the boy king Ptolemy XIII and his older sister, the brilliant, ambitious, and captivating Cleopatra VII. Cleopatra, who had been driven out of Alexandria by her brother's faction, saw her chance. In a famously daring move, she had herself smuggled through enemy lines and into the palace, rolled up inside a carpet or linen sack, which was then presented to Caesar. When the bundle was unrolled, the 21-year-old queen emerged. Caesar was enchanted by her intelligence, charm, and audacity. He became her champion and her lover. His support for Cleopatra enraged the king's faction, leading to the brutal Alexandrian War. For months, Caesar and his small Roman garrison were besieged in the royal palace, fighting for their lives in the streets and harbor of the great city. He was finally saved by the arrival of a relief army, and at the Battle of the Nile in early 47 BCE, Ptolemy's forces were crushed, and the young king drowned in the river. Caesar placed Cleopatra firmly on the throne of Egypt. He then lingered for several months, enjoying a legendary cruise down the Nile with his new queen, during which she conceived his only known son, Ptolemy Caesar, nicknamed Caesarean, Little Caesar. The civil war, however, was not yet over. The remnants of the Republican forces were regrouping. Leaving Egypt, Caesar marched swiftly into Asia Minor to confront Pharnaces II, the king of Pontus, who was trying to reclaim his father's old kingdom. The war was short and decisive. At the Battle of Zela, Caesar annihilated Pharnaces' army and sent back to Rome the most famous and succinct military report in history, Veni, Vidi, Vici. I came, I saw, I conquered. The last bastions of Republican resistance were in Africa, where diehards like Cato the Younger and Metellus Scipio had gathered a large army. Caesar pursued them there, and in 46 BCE at the Battle of Thapsus, he crushed them utterly. In the aftermath, Cato committed suicide in the town of Utica. A man of unbending Stoic principle, he chose death over the humiliation of being pardoned by a man he considered a tyrant. One final pocket of resistance, led by Pompey's sons Cneius and Sextus, flared up in Spain. Caesar marched west once more. The final battle of the Civil War at Munda in 45 BCE was the closest and most brutal of all. Caesar later said that he had fought many times for victory, but at Munda he fought for his life. He won. The war was finally over. Gaius Julius Caesar was the undisputed master of the Roman world. Dictator and deity. Having vanquished his enemies on battlefields from Spain to Egypt, Caesar returned to Rome in 45 BCE not just as a victorious general, but as the absolute master of the state. The war was won, but now came the far greater challenge: governing a world he had conquered and remaking a republic he had broken. The final years of his life were a whirlwind of unprecedented power, sweeping reforms, and growing resentment that would culminate in his bloody assassination. The Roman Senate, now stripped of its most defiant members and packed with his supporters, rushed to shower him with honors. The traditional offices of the Republic were no longer sufficient to contain a man of his stature. His accumulation of power was staggering and rapid. He had been appointed dictator for 10 days in 49 BCE, a constitutional measure to oversee elections. He was made dictator again for a full year after Pharsalus in 48 BCE. Following his victory at Thapsus in 46 BCE, the Senate appointed him dictator for an unprecedented term of 10 years. Finally, in February of 44 BCE, less than a month before his death, they bestowed upon him the ultimate title, Dictator Perpetuo, Dictator in Perpetuity. This was not a temporary emergency measure. This was lifetime autocracy. The Republic, in all but name, was dead. To the old aristocratic families, this concentration of power was terrifying, and Caesar's behavior did little to soothe their fears. He seemed to be a king in all but name. He was granted the right to wear triumphal dress, including the purple toga and laurel wreath, whenever he pleased. His statue was placed on the Capitol Hill alongside those of the 7 ancient kings of Rome. His birth month, Quintilis, was renamed Julius in his honor, our July. The most inflammatory incident occurred at the festival of the Lupercalia on February 15, 44 BCE. As Caesar sat on his gilded chair before the crowds, his loyal co-consul, Mark Antony, ran up and attempted to place a royal diadem on his head, proclaiming that the people offered it to him. The crowd's reaction was muted, even hostile. Caesar, reading the mood perfectly, refused the crown, and the crowd roared with approval. Antony tried again, and again Caesar refused, ordering the diadem to be dedicated to Jupiter, the only king of the Romans. Was it a genuine refusal, a sign that he respected the Republic's traditions? Or was it a carefully staged piece of political theater, a test of public opinion that had backfired? To his enemies in the Senate, it made no difference. The gesture itself was an unforgivable act of monarchical ambition. Yet this was not simply a man consolidating power for its own sake. Caesar's dictatorship unleashed a torrent of pragmatic and far-reaching reforms, an attempt to address the deep-seated problems that had plagued the Republic for a century. His program was a grand, if brutally rushed, experiment in state-building. He confronted the crippling debt crisis, not by the radical cancellation his more extreme supporters wanted, but by a practical measure that remitted a portion of interest payments. He reformed the corrupt system of tax collection in the provinces. He tackled the problem of the Roman mob by cutting the number of citizens eligible for the free grain dole by more than half, from over 320,000 to 150,000, while at the same time launching a massive program of public works, including his magnificent new forum, to provide jobs for the urban poor. Most significantly, he addressed the issue of landless veterans and the urban poor, a source of instability since the time of Marius, by settling over 80,000 of them in new colonies founded across the empire, including at the sites of the formerly destroyed cities of Carthage and Corinth. His political reforms were just as radical and were aimed at transforming Rome from a city-state into the capital of a world empire. He fundamentally altered the Senate, the bastion of the old aristocracy. He increased its size from 600 to 900 members, packing it with his own loyal supporters, men from the equestrian class, centurions from his army, and even prominent nobles from the provinces of Gaul and Spain. This act enraged the old families, as it diluted their power and robbed the Senate of its exclusive prestige, turning it into an instrument of his will. He also increased the number of annual magistrates, creating more opportunities for his allies and a larger pool of experienced administrators for the growing empire. In a move of profound importance for the future, he granted Roman citizenship to many communities outside of Italy, particularly in Spain and Gaul, beginning the long process of integrating the provinces and transforming the very idea of what it meant to be Roman. Perhaps his most enduring reform was the one that governs our lives to this day. The old Roman calendar was a chaotic lunar system, so inaccurate that it had drifted 3 months out of sync with the seasons. Harvest festivals were being held in the spring. Advised by the Alexandrian astronomer Sosigenes, Caesar abolished it. He decreed that the year 46 BCE would be a 445-day year of confusion to realign the calendar with the sun. Then, on January 1st, 45 BCE, he instituted a new solar calendar of 365 days, with an extra day added every 4th year to create a leap year. With minor modifications made by Pope Gregory the 13th 16 centuries later, it is the calendar we still use. Caesar had literally remade time itself. But every reform, every new honor, every consolidation of power deepened the fear and resentment among the remaining traditionalists in the Senate. The assassination plot that formed against him was not a popular uprising. It was an act of aristocratic desperation, the last stand of a ruling class that saw its world, its values, and its monopoly on power being systematically dismantled. The motives of the 60 or more conspirators were a complex web of principle, jealousy, and personal grievance. Some, like Marcus Junius Brutus, were driven by a genuine, if tragically misguided, ideology. A descendant of the legendary Lucius Junius Brutus, who had expelled Rome's last king and founded the Republic 5 centuries earlier, Brutus felt the heavy weight of his ancestry. He truly believed he was acting to save Rome from a tyrant. For others, like the lead conspirator Gaius Cassius Longinus, the motives were more personal. A mixture of professional jealousy, a prickly sense of honor, and a deep-seated animosity towards Caesar's autocratic style. But the most poignant betrayal came from within Caesar's own circle. Many of the key plotters, including Decimus Brutus and Gaius Trebonius, were his former high-ranking generals, men he had led, pardoned after the Civil War, and promoted to high office. For them, the conspiracy was born of a sense that Caesar, the man they had followed and admired, had betrayed the very republic that had given them all their status and honor. They felt he was destroying the system that was the source of their own dignitas. The conspirators chose their moment and their location with care. The Senate meeting on the Ides of March, to be held in the Curia of the Theatre of Pompey. The symbolism was potent. The tyrant would be struck down in the heart of the Republic, in a building dedicated by his former rival. The ancient sources, particularly Suetonius and Plutarch, delight in building the suspense of that final day. The omens were dire. The soothsayer Spurina had famously warned Caesar weeks before to beware the Ides of March. The night before, Caesar's wife, Calpurnia, was tormented by a nightmare in which she saw him stabbed in her arms. On the morning of the 15th, she begged him not to go to the Senate. Caesar, who was not immune to superstition, hesitated. But Decimus Brutus, one of the lead conspirators and a man he considered a close friend, came to his house and mocked his fears, persuading him not to disappoint the waiting senators. On his way to the theater, Caesar saw the soothsayer Spurina and remarked wryly, "The Ides of March are come." Spurina replied ominously, "Aye, Caesar, but not gone." Another man, Artemidorus, thrust a scroll into his hand containing a detailed warning of the plot. Amidst the thronging crowds, Caesar never had a chance to read it. He entered the Curia and took his seat. The conspirators surrounded him, pretending to support a petition from Tullius Cimber for his exiled brother. As Caesar waved them away, Cimber grabbed his toga with both hands and pulled it from his shoulders. It was the signal. Publius Servilius Casca, standing behind him, lunged forward and struck the first blow, a shallow wound near the neck. Caesar cried out in shock, "File Casca, what is this?" and stabbed Casca's arm with his metal stylus. For a moment, the old general fought back. But then the others swarmed him, a frenzy of flashing daggers. He saw faces he knew, men he had pardoned, men he had promoted. He struggled, trying to push his way out, until he saw Marcus Brutus step forward, dagger in hand. At the sight of this man, whom he had treated like a son, all resistance left him. Suetonius reports that he uttered only a single groan, but he also records the tradition that Caesar looked at Brutus and said in Greek, "Kai su, teknon, you too, my child?" He covered his face with his toga and fell at the base of Pompey's statue, his body pierced by 23 wounds. The liberators had struck. The tyrant was dead, and the Roman Republic was about to die with him. The legacy of a titan. The assassins, who styled themselves the liberators, had a plan to kill Caesar, but they had no plan for what came next. In their aristocratic bubble, they seemed to believe that, with the tyrant removed, the Republic would magically spring back to life, and that the people of Rome would hail them as heroes. They were catastrophically wrong. As the blood-spattered senators fled the Curia in panic and confusion, a power vacuum opened, and into it stepped Caesar's most loyal and capable lieutenant, Mark Antony. Antony, a brilliant and dissolute politician, played his hand with masterful skill. Feigning reconciliation, he struck a deal with the conspirators. They would receive amnesty, and in return, all of Caesar's acts and appointments would be ratified. This included Caesar's will. Brutus, against the strenuous objections of the more pragmatic Cassius, made another fatal error. He granted Antony permission to speak at Caesar's public funeral. It was an opportunity Antony would use to unleash hell. In the Roman Forum, before a vast and volatile crowd, Brutus spoke first. His speech was logical, stoic, and reasoned, an appeal to the abstract Roman love of liberty. He explained that he killed Caesar not because he loved him less, but because he loved Rome more. The crowd was placated, even supportive. Then it was Antony's turn. He ascended the rostra, with Caesar's bloody, toga-clad body on display. His funeral oration is one of the most famous speeches in history, immortalized by Shakespeare but powerful in its historical reality. He began cautiously, acknowledging that Brutus and the others were honorable men. But with devastating irony, he proceeded to dismantle their justification. He reminded the crowd of Caesar's victories, of the ransoms he brought to fill the public coffers. He reminded them of Caesar's compassion. When that the poor have cried, Caesar hath wept. He reminded them of the Lupercalia, where Caesar had thrice refused a kingly crown. Was this ambition? He asked again and again, each time followed by the biting refrain. Yet Brutus says he was ambitious, and Brutus is an honorable man. He whipped the crowd's emotions into a frenzy, and then he delivered the masterstroke. He revealed that he held Caesar's will. After a dramatic show of reluctance, feigning that its contents would drive the people to madness, he read it. The will was a political cataclysm. Caesar left his vast, beautiful gardens across the Tiber to the people of Rome as a public park. And to every single Roman citizen, he bequeathed a sum of 75 drachmas. This was not abstract liberty. This was tangible generosity, a final act of love from their fallen father. The crowd erupted. Grief turned to rage. They seized torches from the funeral pyre, seeking to burn the houses of the assassins. Brutus and Cassius were forced to flee for their lives. The mob, in a final act of devotion, took Caesar's body and created a makeshift pyre in the heart of the Forum, cremating him as a god, not a man. The will contained one more, even greater surprise. Caesar had no legitimate son. As his primary heir, he had posthumously adopted his grandnephew, a sickly, unassuming 18-year-old named Gaius Octavius, who had been studying in Greece. This unknown teenager was now Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus. He had inherited Caesar's almost limitless fortune, the loyalty of his veteran legions, and, most powerfully of all, his name. The assassination, intended to restore the Republic, instead plunged it into 13 more years of brutal civil war. The young Octavian, proving to be a political prodigy of chilling genius, sailed to Italy and raised an army. He first allied with the Senate against Antony, then betrayed them to form a new, official triumvirate with Antony and another of Caesar's generals, Marcus Aemilius Lepidus. This second triumvirate was a legal dictatorship, a killing machine that unleashed a new wave of proscriptions, hunting down and executing thousands of their political enemies, including the great orator Cicero, whose head and hands were nailed to the rostra in the Forum. In 42 BCE, at the Battle of Philippi in Greece, the triumvir's armies defeated and killed Brutus and Cassius, avenging Caesar's death. The ultimate irony of the Ides of March was that by killing the man, the conspirators had created the god. In 42 BCE, the Senate, under pressure from the triumvirs, officially deified Caesar. He was now Divus Iulius, the divine Julius. This act transformed Octavian into something unprecedented, Divi Filius, the son of a god. This divine status became the unshakable bedrock of his legitimacy, an ideological weapon his rivals could not match. The alliance of the triumvirs eventually crumbled into another civil war, this time between Octavian in the west and Antony, allied with his lover, Queen Cleopatra of Egypt, in the east. Octavian's victory at the naval battle of Actium in 31 BCE left him as the sole, undisputed master of the Roman world. Learning from his great-uncle's fatal mistake, Octavian was careful to avoid the titles of king or dictator. In a political settlement of 27 BCE, he masterfully restored the Republic, while in reality keeping all ultimate power in his own hands. The grateful Senate bestowed upon him the new, honorific name Augustus. The Roman Republic was a ghost. The Roman Empire had begun. The legacy of Gaius Julius Caesar is as monumental and contradictory as the man himself. He is remembered, rightly, as one of the greatest military commanders in history. His campaigns in Gaul and during the Civil War are still studied as models of strategy, speed, and leadership. His conquest of Gaul permanently shifted Rome's focus into Europe, bringing Western Europe into the orbit of Mediterranean civilization and arguably creating the cultural and linguistic map that exists today. He was the indispensable agent of Rome's transformation from a dysfunctional city-state into a world empire. His reforms, from the calendar to citizenship, laid the groundwork for the stability of the early empire. His literary legacy is just as profound. His commentaries, written with a stark and powerful clarity, are a cornerstone of Latin literature and a masterclass in the art of political propaganda, shaping his own image for posterity. His very name, Caesar, became the ultimate synonym for power, echoing down through the centuries as the title for the emperors who followed him, and mutating into the German Kaiser and the Russian Tsar. The political concept of Caesarism, autocratic, populist rule legitimized by the acclamation of the people and the loyalty of the military, remains a potent and relevant idea in the study of power. Our understanding of this titan is inevitably filtered through the lenses of these later interpreters. His own brilliant but self-serving propaganda in the commentaries provides the foundation. The biographers Plutarch and Suetonius, writing over a century later, used him as a moral case study on the nature of ambition and tyranny, shaping our perception of his character. And, of course, William Shakespeare's towering tragedy, Julius Caesar, has so powerfully defined the popular imagination of the man and his downfall that it is almost impossible to separate the historical figure from the dramatic one. So who was he? A populist savior who cleansed a corrupt and dying republic? Or a power-hungry tyrant who destroyed it for his own glory? The historical record suggests he was both. He was a product of the republic's violent death throes and the ultimate agent of its final transformation. He found the Roman world mired in the corrupt gridlock of a senatorial oligarchy and left it on the cusp of a new imperial age. He tore down a system that no longer worked and, in the chaos, laid the foundations for one that would endure for another 500 years. He was a man of boundless ambition, of ruthless genius, and of world-changing vision. He was Gaius Julius Caesar, the man who came, saw, conquered, and in his death, gave birth to an empire.